And as you can see, now black is going to push a6, by which he gets a better stable position. So that's why here Topalov instantly pushed b5, which also keeps an eye over this c6 and a6 square. And suppose if black goes for a6, trying to attack this pawn, but white can simply goes for a4. And if takes, knight takes b5, and obviously black cannot push c6 due to this undefended bishop, and by this you can see white gets a better outpost for this knight, which is targeting this bishop as well as some important key squares of black. Okay, so in the actual game after b5, here black goes for knight to e4, attacking this undefended knight, and obviously white cannot capture this knight due to the threat of d takes e4. And yeah, so that's why here Topalov brings his bishop to b2, guarding this knight. And that's an inaccuracy by black. This is because now white can bring his knight to f4, which attacks this rook. And here the best option for black is to go back to this e8 square. But suppose if he captured this knight on f4 by bishop takes f4, then after takes, now black can go for c5, and that's a multi-purpose move which first of all attacks this pawn on d4, as well as it also opens the c file if white captured on c6. And in the next move, black is going to bring this another knight to f6, which will support this knight on e4. And by this, you can see now black has this active rook on c file, which can be doubled anytime, as well as these strong knights, which can create some pressure over the white position. Okay, so in the actual game, after the move a5, here Topalov brings his bishop to a3, asking for bishop exchange, so that he can activate his rook. Okay, so now in this position, here computer is suggesting to bring this knight back to e1 and then go for f3, which will attack this active knight. But instead, he decides to play h3, covering this g4 square so that this knight cannot enter. And let's see what will happen if black decides to exchange the queens. Suppose if queen takes c2, then after bishop takes c2, and since this bishop on b7 is inactive, so the best move for black is to bring this bishop to c8, providing this bishop with a more active square. Okay, and but after that, now white can go for knight to e1 so that he can push f3, which attacks this active knight. But let's suppose if he knows that and he decides to bring back this knight to g5, now comes h4, attacking this knight again. And if knight goes back to e6, f3, and then white can bring his bishop to b3 with the idea of moving this knight to c3, which will target this d5 pawn, and by this you can see white will be slightly better. Okay, so in the actual game, after the move queen to c2, here black didn't so that's why black didn't go for queen exchange, and instead he decides to bring his queen to e7. And after that, here Topalov goes for h4, covering this g5 square so that this knight cannot go back, and we can trap this knight by playing f3. So that's why here black brings back his knight to e8, making an escaping square for this knight on e4. And here white is threatening to capture this h5 pawn, taking benefit of this pinned, and the best way to defend this is simply knight to f6, but instead he decides to bring his king to h6, also making a square for this knight. And now white can consider bishop to c2 with the idea of bishop to b3, which targets this d5 pawn, but instead he make a blunder by sacrificing his knight on h5, and that's a blunder because after takes and after that Topalov brings his queen to g8. Basically he wants to checkmate black in two moves, but he forgets that black can easily tackle this by pushing f5, which is what actually happens in the game. And suppose if a game continues like bishop takes f5, if white captured this free pawn, then now comes this amazing move queen to g7, and by this now white is forced to exchange the queen. Suppose after takes, knight takes g7, and now clearly you can see black is a piece up, and this position is completely better for white. Okay, so in the actual game, after f5, here white goes for knight to g3, targeting this pawn on f5. And here black is targeting this e3 pawn, and after that here white simply captures on f5, and obviously you cannot capture this bishop due to the threat of knight takes f5 fork. So that's why here he finds the best move, knight to g6, and now black is targeting this e3 pawn and this h4 pawn. And now in this position, here Topalov sacrificed his knight by knight takes h5, and obviously you cannot capture this knight due to the threat of queen to c7 checkmate. So that's why here instead he decides to capture on e3 by queen takes e3, and simply king to h2. And now it's better for black to grab this pawn on d4, but instead he made a huge blunder by going back to e7. This is because of the following sequence which is played by Topalov, which is he gives a check from his knight first. And here the winning move for white is to just push h5. But why? This is because suppose if black brings his king closer, h6 attacking this knight, and if knight to e8, now comes g5 check, trying to deflect this king so that he can promote. But what if he goes to f7, and after that g6 check? Okay, if king to g8, king to g3, bishop to c8, king to h4, bishop to f5, king to g5, attacking this bishop, and clearly you can see now this is completely over for black. But in the actual game, after the move king takes e7, here Topalov decides to bring his king to f3. And why this move is a mistake? Because now black can hold this position for some time by playing king to f6, and suppose if white continues with the move h5, now comes king to g5. Okay, and if he decides to give a check, simply king to h6, and here white cannot push g5 because then black will simply capture this pawn on h5. And suppose if king to f4, then knight to e6 check, and king to e3, and by this you can see black successfully stopped the attack of white. So that's why after the move which is king to h6, here the best move for white is to bring this knight to f4. But why? This is because of, suppose if king to g5, king to f2, king to h6, king to g2, and this position is still better due to these connected pawns supported by this knight. But yeah, so and this position is winning for white if black do any minor mistake. Okay, so let's go back to our move king to g3. Here black also missed that move, and instead he goes for knight to e6, which is a mistake because now uh, Topalov simply exchanges this knight first, and now you can see white has these three strong pawn chains which cannot be stopped by black. By why? Let's see. And in this position, Sasikiran resigned because suppose if game continues like king to h7, g5, king to h8, g6, and now black king is in stalemate condition, so black is forced to push this pawn, but simply g7 check, king to h7, g8 equal to queen check, king to h6, and finally queen to g6 checkmate. This is your host Bison signing off. Bye bye.